With every single NHL draft class, lofty comparisons get thrown at the top prospects, and this year is no different. And over the course of the season, I've often gotten reminded of multiple NHL superstars when watching this young crop, with a lot of them, I think, having pretty direct comparisons. So today I want to go through most of the top prospects in the 2025 NHL Draft, comparing them to a specific NHL player in both how they play and how their career could turn out. So make sure you guys watch till the end as we go through all the top prospects in this class and their comparisons into the NHL, and make sure that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey prospect content just like this as we lead up to the draft later this June. Now, normally I don't do comparisons when it comes to top prospects in the draft, but this year's class is a bit of an exception because I feel like a lot of the top end players have direct comparisons that are honestly pretty easy to make. There are only a couple of top prospects, which we'll get into later, that are extremely difficult to pin down, but most of these prospects I think have some pretty great NHL comparables, and let's get right into it. Now, comparing our first prospect today to a current NHLer, let's start out with projected first overall pick Matthew Schaefer, likely to be the number one pick by the New York Islanders. The jury is still out on that, but most likely will end up being Schaefer. The interesting thing is that I've heard a ton of different comparisons out there, and I don't quite feel like any of them have been all too consistent. The biggest comparison I've often seen throughout the course of this season has been Drew Doughty, and I don't quite see that, mostly because I see Doughty as more of an offensive zone player only, not as much of a transition guy as Schaefer is, and I think there's a pretty big gap in terms of the physicality, at least long-term, of both of these players. I think Schaefer's more likely to be a transition type of defender, which is why I think the best comparable to him is honestly Roman Josi. Now, I'll say this, I don't think Schaefer's going to be nearly the type of player that Josi will be, at least in terms of the point production. Otherwise, whoever gets him would be really happy to get him no matter where they select. I mean, Roman Josi is somebody that has put up massive numbers throughout his time with the Predators, and you see in his best moments, I mean, 96 points in 80 games. I don't quite see that type of upside with Schaefer unless he's on an absolutely stacked team, which, let's be honest, if he's drafted by the Islanders, probably won't happen. But in terms of the style of play, this is who I think Schaefer projects so well with. I mean, a 6'2" left shot defenseman, obviously you have that, but in terms of Josi, the transition ability, the aggressiveness with the puck, the confidence that he plays the game with, that to me is, I think, Roman Josi to a T. And I think with Josi's case, he's not this exceptional defender or anything, which I think is what Schaefer is going to more likely be. I could see Schaefer being a solid two-way defenseman, but I think, again, most of his value is going to come from the transition play, pushing pace up the ice, which is what Josi does best. Obviously, Schaefer is likely to go a lot higher than 38th overall, or at least hopefully in his draft class, but I think in terms of the comparables, I think Josi fits the best. Maybe not in terms of NHL projection, because I do think Josi is probably a tier ahead, but I would say Schaefer is just a tier below. Still an exceptional player. If you're a tier below Josi, you're still pretty good. Now let's go on to our second player here in Michael Misa, and I gotta say, out of the top 5 prospects in this class, I think Misa is honestly the hardest to make a direct NHL comparable, because I don't think there's anybody that quite matches up to Misa's level and perfect style of play. There's been the comparisons to John Tavares, which I just at this point don't quite see anymore. Maybe at the start of the season, perhaps, but I think Misa's skating ability has improved so much over the past couple of seasons that I just don't see Tavares at all. Maybe he ends up becoming a type of player like that, but I think his speed is too much of a weapon to be a Tavares-like. Now, the player that he actually reminds me the most, and this was brought up by Chris Peters of Flow Hockey, a perfect comparison in my opinion, I actually gotta go to Tyler Seguin here for Michael Misa. And I don't think it's perfect, because again, I think Misa is a little bit more speed-based, but I think back at Sagan's career before the multiple injuries that he had and had to deal with, especially in the lower body, and I could see it a little bit more. Again, I think Misa's a little bit faster, but in terms of the type of player, in terms of the type of power he could provide at the center position, that's what I kind of see. And I think Misa will have a little bit more point production, but still, in Sagan's case, his best times, getting points like 84 points in 80 games back in 2014, that's still a pretty exceptional player, especially back then. So I think pre-injury Tyler Seguin is actually pretty close between these two guys, and that's probably the best comparison I've heard yet. With Seguin, the all-around ability, the lack of weaknesses, especially as a younger player, that's, I think, what Misa projects very well to be. Though I think at Misa's case, he will be a better centerman at his peak than Tyler Seguin was, but still, I think it's pretty similar in terms of the overall impact. Now let's move on to James Hagens, one of the most interesting prospects in this draft class for the variants, especially in terms of stock in his draft year. But I think in Hagens' case, I'm obviously a lot more high on him, and one of the big reasons is just because of the comparables. To me, how much he lines up with players like Jack Hughes, but especially Logan Cooley. Now, I think in terms of the play, in terms of what they could be at the NHL level, I think Cooley is maybe the best comparable, which is funny because Hagens could potentially become a Utah Mammoth, even though I think it is unlikely in terms of what Utah wants. In terms of the players, I think having both Cooley and Hagens, you get two players that are pretty similar here. When it comes to the skill set, the creativity, what they put out there with their playmaking, I think both of them are pretty similar. I do think Cooley has the edge in terms of pure creativity and skating ability especially, but in terms of the defensive play, I often think Hagens is a little bit underrated, and I think is maybe a little bit more prepared for the NHL already than Logan Cooley was in his draft year, which of course you end up going to the NCAA afterwards. But in terms of the point totals, in terms of the playmaking, these two guys I think line up pretty similarly, and especially if Cooley were in the NCAA in his draft year, I think points-wise, they would have lined up pretty similarly as well. But even though Cooley was the best comparison I can make, I still think Hagens is a little bit different than what we've seen before. Again, in terms of the overall ability and a little bit less pace than a player like Logan Cooley, it was hard to put out because I don't think a Jack Hughes fits either, because I think the skating is even ahead of Cooley as well. So there's a pretty big difference there. But I do think Hagens in terms of the Cooley comparable makes sense, and that's really the only one that I often come back to and actually see as realistic. Now we go on to Porter Martone, which I think maybe out of anybody has actually gotten the most comparisons to NHL players in this draft class. You've already heard, of course, the comparisons to Matthew Tkachuk, to Brady Tkachuk, to Brad Marchand in the past. But I'm gonna be honest, the more I watch Martone, the more I just do not see that comparison whatsoever. And sure, of course, a big right wing, 6'3", power forward-like character, you're going to have the comparisons to Matthew Tkachuk already, but I don't quite see that in Martone's game. Sure, he can drop the gloves and sometimes he can get physical, but I don't think it's quite the name of the game for Martone quite as much as a Matthew Tkachuk, for example. With Porter Martone, he's a lot more of a finesse player, a lot more of a Beckett Seneca when it comes to the shift-to-shift type of play. He can have physicality and it protects the puck extremely well, but a lot of Martone's game is actually based on the skill set he has, the deking ability he's able to provide, and the one-on-one ability, which is just straight up magical. So in that case, I don't think Martone quite has a perfect NHL comparable. Well, one guy I often find is a little bit similar is an Alex Tuch. Now, another power forward and somebody that can get some big physicality, but I think in Tuch's case, he's somebody that can also beat you in one-on-one situations, has a lot of good offense to him, and especially on the rush, is a pretty dynamic player. I do think the goal scoring is a bit of a difference because I think Martone will be more of a playmaker. Again, I don't think there's this perfect comparison to Martone for what he could be, but what he also is on the ice. But I think Tuch is a pretty good comparison in terms of the play, in terms of what he could end up being, but also the overall offense and what they could provide. Again, Matthew Tkachuk is a possibility, Brady Tkachuk is a possibility as well, but I think Martone had to take steps in his physical game consistently to get to that type of level. Whereas with Tuch, I think it's a little more balanced with the offense and the physicality, and I think in terms of Martone, that's more if you're getting, in general, I think just a more physical, more willing to fight Beckett Seneca. That's kind of what I see out of Porter Martone. So the Matthew Tkachuk type of comparisons, I can see why they've come up, but again, I don't quite see that in Martone's shift-to-shift play. Now we're going to Victor Eklund next up, and I think he's much more of a Matthew Tkachuk type of player on a shift-to-shift basis than a Porter Martone, but I don't quite see Eklund being as effective as a Tkachuk, getting under your skin. That's not quite Eklund's game, but I do think in terms of the intensity, in terms of what he reminds me in his draft year, I actually think there's a lot of Seth Jarvis in Victor Eklund. Now, of course, that is a lofty comparison to make, but I also think in his draft, Seth Jarvis was extremely underrated. He was somebody I had more in my 9 to 10 range. Of course, went 13 to Carolina, but I think in a lot of public lists as well was outside of the top 15, which I just thought was criminal for a player that had the intensity, but also the skill set to back it up. But in terms of the size, in terms of what they could be, I think Eklund and Jarvis are extremely similar. Now, I do think in terms of the upside, I don't know if he has quite Seth Jarvis level of playmaking and point production. I mean, what he's been able to do the past couple of seasons has been phenomenal. Almost a point per game this last year if you combine both the regular season and the playoffs. So I don't think it's going to be quite at Jarvis level in terms of production, but still pretty good. The big things that keep me reminding of Jarvis are the smaller size, but also the intensity, the amount of board battles he wins, and so much passion for the game that Victor Eklund provides. He's just so much fun out there and wants to create chaos chaos. And you see in 42 Allsvenskan games, he did a pretty good job at that. 19 goals, 12 assists, 31 points. I think he's just going to be such a versatile player, such an effective support player, which is what Seth Jarvis has become. One of the best support players in the entire NHL. And I see Eklund being pretty similar in terms of that projection. Now we move on to Caleb Denoye, and this is another one that I also don't think has a perfect comparison, because there are ones that I've thrown out, potentially like Pierre-Luc Dubois, but I do think Denoye has a little bit more passion and pace than a player like Dubois, though I do think in terms of their rush offense, how they work with their playmaking, I think they're pretty similar. One player that I do think fits a little bit is Nick Schmaltz, and it's not quite perfect because Schmaltz has turned more into a winger, but in Schmaltz's draft year, he was a centerman. He was more of a player up the middle of the ice, which of course is what Denoye I think will ultimately become. But in terms of the playmaking, in terms of the pace when the puck gets on his team stick, I think they factor in pretty similarly. But I also think have issues in terms of the consistency, in terms of what you want out of them. But I think Schmaltz as a center is what you're likely going to get out of a player like Denoye. One comparison that I liked a little bit as well was Nico Hischier, but I don't see Denoye being nearly as much of a defensive factor as a player like Hischier. I think Denoye could be fine, but I don't think it's going to be a strength by any means. So even though the rest of the game in Hischier's case, I think fits up pretty well, again, that perfect comparison is pretty hard to come by. Schmaltz, I think in terms of the overall impact, I think makes sense for a player like Denoye who would drive offense up the center of the ice. But again, not perfect in Schmaltz as a winger, but it's the closest I could come up with. Now, moving on to Anton Frell, this was a fascinating one to come up with an NHL comparable because this is all over the board. I mean, it really depends if you see Frell as a center or as a wing, but that factors into my comparison. I mean, in Frell's case, he was fantastic in the Ihs-Wozniak, especially in the second half with the goal scoring, especially the power play ability. And the player he kind of reminds me a little bit of is Sam Reinhart. Now, not completely. I don't think he's going to be nearly the type of efficient player that Sam Reinhart is. I mean, it would be pretty impossible to do that. 94 points, 57 goals last year for Florida. That's a game-breaking type of player. I don't see Frell quite at that level, but a Sam Reinhart light I could absolutely see. Reinhart, of course, is a player that has played both wing and center at the NHL level, and both pretty effectively, but is factoring in more as a winger, which I also think could be a possibility for Frell. But I see the puck protection, I see the physical attributes that he has, but I also see the goal scoring, the power play quarterbacking, and how much of a lethal weapon he can be on the man advantage. Reinhart, of course, has been that for Florida, and that shot has been a major reason why. But like Sam Reinhart, I think Frell is going to be amazing in the NHL playoffs. I think he's going to be lethal on the man advantage and just bring a lot of great offense to you. But again, I think Sam Reinhart light, not nearly the type of same overall impact, but a similar type of trajectory and of course the versatility in the position they play. Now let's go on to Ratty Murka, who I think is one of the most projectable, safe defensemen of this draft class, which I think means that he has a ton of comparisons that make quite a bit of sense. Of course, big 6'6" size as a right shot 17-year-old D. He's going to get a lot of interest from NHL teams, but rightfully so, because the skating level is so good, how much potential he brings with his defensive game. I think there's a lot to like here in Murka, and even though I don't see massive point totals, I think he'll be a very safe, very projectable top 4D. There is so many comparisons that could be made. Guys like Colton Parayko, even though I think Murka doesn't have quite the shot. Matthias Ekholm is also there. Ivan Provorov I was considering. The two that I think make the most sense, though, is Simon Edvinsson and Adam Larsson. Now, I think Edvinsson, in terms of the size, especially Murka's right up there in terms of the size, but also the strengths and weaknesses, with Edvinsson having brilliant skating, brilliant defensive habits, but also having some inconsistencies in his decision-making and how much that's able to project in the next level. I think the same exact issues and concerns and strengths are there with a player like Ratty Murka. But in terms of what he becomes at the NHL level, I think that Adam Larsson, in terms of the trajectory, makes a lot of sense as somebody that has found himself as more defensive penalty kill specialist, but can also put some points up here and there, especially with his goal scoring. 8 goals in 2023, 7 goals this last year. So I think in terms of Murka, Larsson is the greatest career trajectory, while I think Simon Edvinsson, in terms of the style, makes the most sense for a comparison. Now we go on to a big riser for me in Jake O'Brien out of the Brantford Bulldogs. Somebody that I love quite a bit in terms of the playmaking, the IQ he has, and how much he's able to drive up a line. I mean, you see in 66 games this year, 32 goals, 66 assists, 98 points. He was an absolute beast up there with Nick Lardis in the OHL. Those two doing so much good together. But in O'Brien's case, he's not just a Lardis merchant or anything. He's somebody that drives so much possession on his own stick. And the player here reminds me of a little bit, and I don't think it's going to be quite as successful, but I see a lot of Robert Thomas in Jake O'Brien, and I can't not go back to it because it's just so perfect to me. With both of these players, they are extreme playmakers. They are guys that think the game so advanced. They are guys that just think so many steps ahead of the play. And in Thomas's case, especially, has built himself up into one of the best playmakers in the NHL. These last couple of seasons, back-to-back 60 assist years. And I don't know if O'Brien's going to be quite at that level over a point-per-game type of guy, but I think in terms of the style of play, and again, how advanced that brain is, how good they're able to get the puck on their teammate's stick, I mean, these two guys are pretty much intertwined to me. Now we go into a player that I think goes pretty overlooked, but I think is still one of the best players of this draft class in Colin Potter out of ASU. And the reason he's so high on this list is because there is just so many perfect comparisons to me with Colin Potter. Now, I don't think he's going to be quite at the Clayton Keller type of level, but to me, the most similar projection in terms of the play he can have as well as the impact is Nikolai Ehlers, who I think is pretty much the perfect one. Now, I think Colin Potter could play center, but also is more likely to play wing at the NHL level, which of course Ehlers does fit. But in Potter's case, I love the skill, the speed, the intensity that he plays with off and on the puck, but he's somebody that just brings so much skill, especially in tight moments, in really tense situations. Potter is able to bring out that skill set in so many creative ways, and he's somebody that didn't put up monstrous numbers or anything, but I think will be putting up some pretty good numbers at the NHL level once he gets more accustomed to the NCAA, gets some more time under him, and is actually able to adjust completely. In a player like Nikolai Ehlers' case, he was somebody that went 9th overall to Winnipeg, so a pretty high pick, but somebody that was also a bit of a project, took another year in the QMJHL, absolutely tore it up there, and then put up some pretty good NHL numbers right after that. I do think in Potter's case, he could be pretty similarly frustrating, where there maybe is some injuries, maybe because of his slight body that ends up becoming a factor, and there are times where you want a little bit more in the playoffs, but in terms of what Colin Potter can do, in terms of what he can create for your team, he pushes play exactly like Ehlers to me. Now we move on to Sean Aitchison, one of the most electrifying defensemen of this draft class, and he's another one that I really struggled to make a direct comparison. There was ones like Jake Wallman that I thought could be interesting in terms of the electricity they provide as a defenseman, but one player that I thought really fit well was actually Matt Dumba, and especially going back to his draft year, pretty similar in terms of what their draft position could end up being, with him getting drafted top 10 by Minnesota back in 2012. I think Aitchison could be around that range. You see in 64 games in the OHL this year, 26 goals, 59 points, big time goal scorer, big time clutch player, and brings so much physical intensity, big fighting ability, as well as big rushing opportunistic style. In Matthew Dumba's case, I mean, even though it's been inconsistent in his NHL career, when he has been at his best, there has been those type of moments. And you go back to his draft year, the goal scoring was a major part of things. 20 goals in 69 WHL games for Red Deer. He was somebody that has had his inconsistencies, but I think again at Dumba's best, he was somebody that brought heavy offense, heavy goal scoring ability, made you absolutely despise him, which I think is what Aitchison is going to do perfectly. The hope is that Aitchison can defend a little bit better than Matt Dumba can, but I think Aitchison has the potential to do so, plus the goal scoring, plus the electricity at Matthew Dumba's peak. That's what I think you're getting out of a player like Aitchison, which is still a pretty solid player, though hopefully, again, the drop-off isn't nearly as rough. Now we move on to one of the biggest risers in the draft class in Brady Martin out of the OHL, and he's somebody that has really quickly risen in a lot of key areas because of his second half in the OHL, because of the World Juniors especially, where he was terrific for Canada. I am still a little bit lower on him personally in terms of the upside and what he can be. There's been a lot of comparisons to Sam Bennett especially. I don't quite see that. I'm going to be honest. I think Brady Martin has a lot of great attributes, but I don't think he has quite the skill that Sam Bennett has, especially especially, but I don't think it's going to be much more than a 30-35 point third line centerman, which is exactly why I think a Jack McBain comparison makes a lot more sense than Sam Bennett. Now, Martin doesn't have quite the size of McBain. McBain at 6'4", 218 pounds, which is a big reason why the hit totals are so massive. But I think in Brady Martin's case, he's still a very fluent hitter. He's still somebody that is very efficient with it, even though the size isn't quite there. But in terms of what they could be at the NHL level, in terms of the impact, I think McBain makes a lot of sense. You're looking at a 25-30 point type of center. I think Brady Martin may have a little bit more goal scoring in him, but again, pretty similar in terms of what I think they project to be. In McBain's case, though, is often, especially this last year, I think it was top 5 in terms of hits in the NHL, especially among centermen. He was right up there, at least. He was somebody that was physically dominant, and I see Brady Martin doing the same. We go on to Malcolm Spence, a recent commit to the University of Michigan, but of course a massive part of the Erie Otters program. You've seen 65 games in the OHL this year, 32 goals, 73 points, a just very effective, very versatile wing who I think does so many different things right, but is kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. The player that I see him translating like the most is actually Alex Iafallo. Now, I had a couple of options for this one. I went with potentially a Michael Bunting, maybe a Blake Coleman perhaps, but I think Iafallo makes the most sense in terms of what Spence I think is going to be at the NHL level, which is much more of a two-way defensive physical type of wing, which Alex Iafallo is pretty perfect in that role for Winnipeg. You see over the past few seasons some pretty good point totals, his best being 43 points in 70 games for LA back in 2020. That's, I think, the type of upside you're looking at in a Malcolm Spence. Not much more than that, but also not much less. A very consistent wing where you know what you're getting out of him. Now, for the last player I wanted to make an NHL comparable for, let's go on to Carter Bear, who is just an absolute dog out there, who is just going to be so interesting, so much fun to watch. I think Brian Rust could actually be a pretty interesting comparable. Pretty similar size. Rust has carved out such a unique, such an intense career, one that has had so many ups and downs, especially with the injuries. I think Carter Bear could also do the same. I think it's going to be a lot more hyped, and especially the goal scoring, getting a lot more credit in his draft year. I mean, you can see in 56 games, 40 goals, 82 points. This is a big time player already. But Rust was a little bit doubted upon because of the size issue. And in Bear's case, playing a much more physical game as a smaller forward, I think there also could be pretty similar doubts there as well. But in Rust's case, even when he has had the injuries, he's bounced back in some pretty massive ways, putting up big totals, especially on the power play with some of the best players in the league. I think Bear is going to be in a pretty similar role where he's your third best player on a line, but he just does so many little things right, especially in the boards, in those intense spots that gets the puck back to your best players. And like an Arturi Lehkonen type of player as well, just does so many of the hard things and finishes at such a perfect rate that he's going to be such a special and valuable player. In fact, maybe Arturi Lehkonen is actually a better comparable in terms of the goal scoring and how they score their goals, but I think also Rust in terms of the grit he has, in terms of the intensity and what they can be, I think Bear also fits up pretty well there. So Lehkonen, Brian Rust type player, those are two pretty solid guys to translate into. But those are some of my comparisons for the top NHL prospects in the 2025 NHL Draft, and hopefully you guys did end up enjoying. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell. I want to know your thoughts down below. What did you think about my comparisons about these top prospects? Did you guys agree? Did you guys disagree? And of all these top NHL prospects, who do you think has the most realistic NHL comparable, and what would that comparable be? Let me know your thoughts down below on that. Of course, share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online, and click on this card for all of my 2025 draft content, which is a quickly growing playlist, by the way, right in one playlist. And I will see you guys in the next one. Have a fantastic hockey day, and goodbye.